Welcome back to the Chord by Chord series. In the last two episodes, we explored the 1-5-1 progression, the foundation of tonal harmony. In this video, we're going to turn the 5 chord into 5-7 by stacking another third on top, which adds tension and heightens the drive back to 1. 5-7 is the most commonly used 7th chord, and you'll see it just as often as you see 5 in its triadic form. I'm going to show you how to connect 1 to 5-7 in 4 voices, but the most important takeaway here is how 5-7 resolves to 1. In real music, many chords lead to 5-7, so as we add more chords to our inventory, we'll see many different ways to get there. But once a progression arrives at 5-7, it almost always moves back to 1. As before, we'll start in the key of C major, and in this episode, we'll add a 7th above the root of our 5 chord, which is scale degree 4 of the key, or the note F added to a G major triad. Let's start with the origin of 7th chords. 7th chords emerged naturally from the standard 5-1 motion. When moving from 5 to 1, like in the Mi Re Do progression from the last episode, one voice moves from scale degree 5 in the 5 chord to scale degree 3 in the 1 chord. If we connect these two pitches with a passing tone, we get scale degree 4. Over time, what was originally perceived as a passing tone came to be understood as an integral part of the harmony itself, giving birth to a whole new category of chords, 7th chords. This historical development also explains why the 7th of the chord will always resolve downward by step. It preserves its original function as a passing tone, ensuring smooth voice leading and harmonic coherence. Now listen to what happens if we don't resolve the 7th, like in this example with it stepping up instead of down. This probably doesn't sound bad to you per se, but something probably feels off about it, and what that is the 7th of the chord not resolving properly. Now, the 7th of the chord is called the chordal 7th, and even though we now think of it as part of the chord and not a passing tone, we still have to handle it with care. Any dissonance follows specific rules, and 7ths are dissonant. Therefore, chordal 7ths must also follow specific rules. When writing any 7th chord, the voice that has the chordal 7th has 2 rules: how it's approached and how it's left. First, it must be approached either by step, by common tone, or occasionally by ascending leap. In this video, we'll focus on progressions that approach the 7th by step. This is called the preparation, and it ensures that the 7th maintains its identity as a non-chord tone. Frankly, a lot of people forget about this. 7ths are dissonances, and they must be prepared. And second, the 7th must step down to a note in the next chord, and this direction is always down, never up. For a 5-7 chord, 99% of the time, this means the chordal 7th, which is scale degree 4, will step down to scale degree 3 in a 1 chord. This is called the resolution, and this is non-negotiable. The 7th of any chord must step down to a note in the next chord. The chordal 7th is a type of tendency tone in Western music, meaning that it has an expectation to move a particular direction, down. We've already seen one type of tendency tone, the leading tone, which has an expectation to move up. This is important. The 5-7 chord contains 2 tendency tones that move in different directions and both involve the number 7, so they're easy to confuse. Remember, the leading tone is scale degree 7 and it wants to lead back up to 1. The 7th of a 5-7 chord is scale degree 4 and it wants to resolve down to 3. If we just play these tendency tones and the notes they lead to, what we get is a tritone moving towards its own natural resolution. When the leading tone is on the bottom and the chordal 7th is on top, the tritone is spelled as a diminished 5th, which resolves inward to a 3rd. When the chordal 7th is on the bottom and the leading tone is on top, the tritone is spelled as an augmented 4th, which resolves outward to a 6th. Just the sounds of these tritones and their resolutions are enough to imply a 5-7 chord resolving to 1, even though half the notes are missing. The resolution of the tritone is another critical element of Western music. Now that we understand what we're working with a little bit better, let's look at it in context. In 4-part writing, there are exactly 2 ways to connect 1 to 5/7 and back to 1 smoothly, and they are both completely stepwise in the upper voices. Anything else would introduce awkward leaps or unresolved tendency tones. Let's break these down into 2 essential approaches. Option 1. Let's look at this alternate version of the mi, re, do from the previous episode. All of the voices are the same, except what was the 5/5/3 line is now 5/4/3, and that 4 is the 7th of the 5/7 chord. Here, 5/4/3 and 3/2/1 descend by step in parallel motion, while the 1/7/1 line steps to and from the leading tone. Let's give this a different name that shows what the chordal 7th, which is scale degree 4, or fa, is doing, the sol fa mi. Sol prepares the 7th, fa, which resolves down to mi. In this progression, the chordal 7th is prepared, and both it and the leading tone resolve correctly. Just like the mi, re, do, we end up with an incomplete 1 chord with 3 roots, 1/3, and no 5th. Let's just focus on the last 2 chords here. With all 4 members of the 5/7 chord present, there is in fact no possible way to resolve the 7th and resolve the leading tone and have both of these chords be complete. With this option, we sacrifice having a complete 1 chord so that all of the notes of the 5/7 chord resolve correctly. This will be true anytime we use 5/7 to 1. A complete 5/7 will always lead to an incomplete 1 if we resolve everything correctly. But Dr. Fromm, you might be thinking, since the voice on 2 isn't doing either of the required resolutions, couldn't it just jump to 5 instead so that both chords are complete, like this? Well, that breaks an important voice leading rule, and I want you to figure that one out on your own. So if you know why that doesn't work, let us know in the comments. Now, just like the mi, re, do, you can choose to not resolve the leading tone if it's in an inner voice, and have one line move 1/7/5. As I explained in the previous video, unresolved leading tones are much less noticeable in the alto or tenor lines, so composers sometimes did this in order to end on a complete 1 chord. But it is less smooth and more awkward, and if you put it in the soprano, it's wrong. I really think everything just works better when you resolve the leading tone in any voice, because that's never wrong. But if you look at almost any Bach chorale, this is his favorite way to voice 5/7 to 1 at the ends of phrases. Soprano moving 2/1, bass moving 5/1, tenor moving 4/3, resolving the chordal 7th, but then the alto moves from 7 to 5 with an unresolved leading tone. Since Bach's chorales are pre-existing melodies that he harmonized, the soprano always ends 2/1, so he didn't have to worry about resolving the leading tone in that voice. He seems to prefer to have a final complete chord over resolving the leading tone in an inner voice. Just look at the first page of the collected Bach chorales. There are 5 examples of exactly this voicing of a 5/7 to 1 progression with an unresolved 7th in the alto, including the end of both chorales, as well as some of the internal cadences in the first phrase of each one. Let's zoom in on the final phrase of the first chorale and hear how that works. Going back to the sol fa mi, these completely stepwise lines of 5/4/3, 3/2/1, and 1/7/1 do the job perfectly, and you'll find these in the upper voices in any order. I do want to point out something here that's not a mistake. Look at the soprano and the tenor. There's a 5th between them in the first chord and a 5th between them in the second chord. Aren't these parallel 5ths? Well, the first one is a perfect 5th, and the second one is a diminished 5th, or tritone. The term parallel 5ths always refers to perfect 5ths, not diminished 5ths. This has another name though, unequal 5ths, which is any time 2 voices move between perfect and diminished 5ths, or vice versa. Unequal 5ths have a complicated set of rules for when they're allowed or not allowed, but you're always allowed to move from a perfect 5th to a diminished 5th, which is what we have here. So this is good. These are not parallel 5ths. Now on to option 2. Let's see what happens when we approach the 7th of the chord from below, moving 3/4/3 or mi fa mi. Another voice will move 1/7/1, resolving the leading tone, and another voice can stay on 5 through all 3 chords. Look at how perfect those lines are. They're completely stepwise, and one of them is completely stationary. In this version, we've left the 5th out of the 5/7 chord, and instead we have 2 roots, 1/3, and 1/7. Again, this is standard practice. Leaving the fifth out and having two roots sounds just as strong as if we had all four notes. And by voicing it this way, we can end with a complete one chord. This is more useful to use earlier in a progression in case you don't want that one chord to be the end of your progression. Again, the most important thing here is how the 5-7 chord resolves to 1. Just like the sol fa mi, the 4 moves to 3 and 7 moves to 1 over a bass that leaps from 5 to 1. The only difference is instead of the final voice moving to 1, it stays on 5 through both chords. Let's recap. 5-7 to 1 works best with an omitted fifth in one of the chords. Either you leave the fifth out of the 5-7 chord so the final 1 chord can be complete, or you leave the fifth out of the final 1 chord so the 5-7 chord can be complete. I urge you to lean into this and get comfortable with incomplete chords with omitted fifths, because they're very common and they make voice leading so much easier. One of the most common mistakes I see students make is parallel fifths between 5-7 and 1, and omitting the fifth from either one of these chords automatically prevents that because it removes one of the fifths. And don't forget, these progressions work identically in both major and minor keys. Let's listen to the sol fa mi and the mi fa mi in C minor. These two voicings of 1-5-7-1 teach important concepts: preparing the chordal seventh by approaching it by stepwise motion, resolving the seventh down, resolving the leading tone up, and how all of this is easier with incomplete chords. And don't forget, the unequal fifths when you move from 1 to 5-7 are always acceptable. We've already seen how Bach handles 5-7 to 1 in his chorales. Let's look at some examples of orchestral music where 5-7 and 1 are used repeatedly. Since more than 4 voices are available, they don't have to worry about incomplete chords. The result is usually a mi-fa-mi progression with another voice filling in scale degree 5 the whole time, making both chords complete. Repeating 5-7 and 1 is often a closing gesture, just like repeating the triadic 5 and 1 we heard in earlier episodes. Let's listen how Mozart uses it at the end of the first movement of his 40th symphony in G minor. It's also a classic move by Rossini as he approaches an ending. Here's the same progression at the end of the William Tell Overture in E major. And a Sousa march wouldn't be a Sousa march without entire phrases of alternating 1 and 5-7. So that's how you connect 5-7 and 1. This resolution technique will come up again and again as we explore more complex harmonic progressions. It's a critical concept that's both easy to get wrong, but simple to get right if you remember that it's okay to use incomplete chords. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more chord connections at Dr. Fromm's Music Lab.